Okay, so why don't we get started? It's, I think, a minute past. So thank you all for coming today to today's colloquium. We're very excited to have Lance Dixon here today from Slack, who's been will be visiting us actually today and tomorrow. And let me tell you a little bit about Lance and his work. Lance actually originated here from Pasadena. I actually learned that he was born in Pasadena, which was kind of striking to me. He actually was also an undergraduate at Caltech doing his BS and his BS in physics and applied math here before moving on to his PhD at Princeton. After a postdoctoral fellowship at Slack, he then became a professor at Princeton and then moved back to Slack, where he's been a professor ever since. Lance is one of the leaders of a field of physics that I'm a part of, which is at the interface between kind of particle physics and scattering theory. This is, of course, an age-old program of understanding what happens to things when you hit them together and what comes out. He's pioneered many of the kind of deepest ideas and most important practical tools for understanding what happens at colliders. He has been awarded many awards for his work, including a fellowship of the American Physical Society, the Galileo Galilei Medal. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and he also has won the J.J. Sakurai Prize for path-breaking contributions to the calculation of perturbative scattering amplitudes, which have led to a deeper understanding of QFT and novel powerful tools for computing QCD processes. I'm very excited to have Lance here, and I want to emphasize that he's one of these kind of miraculous fellows who can somehow do work that is practically useful to experiments, that's like in the weeds with respect to what experimentalists measure, but at the same time can make contributions to kind of deep structures lying within the laws of physics, which I think will tell us today with this very provocative title, DNA of particle scattering. So with that said, please join me in welcoming Lance for today's talk.
Thanks a lot, Cliff, for that very generous introduction. Yes, it all started here when I was sitting in that seat, and Professor Politzer was lecturing in Physics 1, along with Ricardo Gomez, if I remember right. Correct. And yeah. So also I wanted to say that I really was really sorry to hear about all the fires up in Altadena, and so really touched by it. We have a lot of sympathy for people who lost things in the fires. So, but yeah, I want to talk today about quote the DNA of particle scattering. And why would I mention DNA? It's not a physical thing. It's just an analogy. And the analogy is that there's a kind of code word or a language that underlies particle scattering that we can try to decipher, and it tells us things, and we can use it to go to higher accuracy in the predictions for the behavior of particles at high energy colliders, such as the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. And you won't actually need to know very much biology. Particle physics, as we know, has a sort of standard model that is the guiding structure that governs pretty much all of the observed phenomena that we have, besides things like dark matter. But molecular biology has an analogous structure, which is at its center and is called the central dogma. And although the standard model is kind of a really lousy name for such a edifice that's lasted for so long, I think we can agree that central dogma is kind of worse. So anyway, the central dogma involves how the instructions for life actually get turned into all of the behavior that we have in biology around us. And of course, it's all the information is carried by DNA, which is then transcribed into RNA and translated into proteins or sequences of amino acids that then fold up. But we're mostly just going to be talking about the information and how it's carried. And so I won't even talk about RNA or proteins. And the information is carried in sequences of base pairs. which are conveniently abbreviated by letters. So we have 4 types of base pairs: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. But as far as the information being carried, it's just you have 4 choices at any given spot on a in a DNA location: A, T, G, or C. So you have 4 letters, and you can do a lot of things with 4 letters, but you can't do everything. So the letters are combined in DNA, they're organized into triplets, and it's really the triplet sequences that tell you what's going to happen. And this is a little bit complicated chart, but it's supposed to show how you have 4 choices for the first of the 3 letters in a codon, 4 more choices coming out, and then 4 more choices after that. But you'll notice that there are 64 things around this wheel, but they're not all different out here. And these are the different amino acids. So there's a redundancy in the code. There are only 20 amino acids, and there's also some stop and start instructions, but that's far less than the 64 that you would get by raising 4 to the 3rd power. So the information content is not 4 to the number of base pairs, or 64 to the number of base pairs over 3, but it's only 20 to the number of base pairs over 3. But we have billions of base pairs, and so that's still an enormous number. And of course, only a small fraction of that actually do anything interesting. That is, most of them would make amino acids that would not fold into very interesting proteins. So there's much more, structure or limited numbers of things that happen. Why am I telling you all this biology is because there's an analogous code for particle scattering. So there's a kind of instruction set, and we can describe many of the kinds of functions that appear in scattering amplitudes using a system of sequences of letters that are going to resemble in some way the DNA code. Now you might say, why haven't I heard about this before? Well, the code is not as universal as the DNA code. When you go from one scattering process to another, the code changes. And for complicated processes, it's so complicated we don't even know what the letters are. But in simple processes, we know what these sets of letters are, and we can use them to organize the calculations and do them in completely different ways. So we also know that the letters in DNA, there are billions of them, and we only have short sequences so far in this work. It turns out that the number of letters is twice the loop order, and we haven't been able to go past 8 loops, which it corresponds to 16 letter sequences. And the letter has many redundancies, which is sort of similar to the codon redundancies. But if we understand these letters in more general settings, we think that we can use them to understand scattering at a deeper level, try to understand what's going on structurally, and use that information to push to more precise computations. So one of the big applications, practical applications that you can use all this technology for is at the Large Hadron Collider. So the Large Hadron Collider collides protons with each other at somewhere around 13 tera electron volts. And these protons, they are bags of quarks and gluons. So at very short distances, it's really quarks and gluons that are colliding with each other, bouncing off each other, producing new particles like the Higgs boson. And in order to understand the properties of the standard model and the properties of the Higgs boson, you need to know what those probabilities are quite precisely to match the precision of the experimental measurements. And so this confrontation between experiment and theory requires higher order corrections in the thing that governs the interactions of quarks and gluons, which is the strong interactions. And there's a strong coupling, alpha S. And so to get good precision, you need to work to higher orders in alpha S. And that's where some of these code words for QCD scattering become important. So I was walking around Boston, and it came to me by looking at this truck that QCD is really all about you. It's you have QCD in your nuclei, in your protons and neutrons. So it's quality custom distribution is what it's supposed to stand for. But anyway, in the real QCD, the key that allows us to make any predictions at all is the discovery of asymptotic freedom by David Politzer, David Gross, and Frank Wilczek back in '73. And the key point is that the coupling constant in QCD depends on the distance scale that you measure that. And this is a plot of many experimental measurements of the strong coupling constant. And you can see that as you go to short distances or very high momentum transfers, the coupling becomes increasingly weak. And a typical reference scale is about 100 GeV, where the coupling is about 1/10. So there are similar perturbative calculations you could do in quantum electrodynamics, which show up in precision measurements in atomic physics. In that case, the coupling is 1/137, much smaller. In the case of QCD, the coupling is small, but not incredibly small. And so you often need several terms in the expansion. When we go to very long distances, and very long only means about a femtometer, or the size of the proton, the coupling gets very large, and we say that the theory confines, and the quarks are bound by this strong force into the proton. So we have a confining region, and then a short distance or high transverse momentum, high energy calculable region. So a typical LHC collision has pieces we understand better and pieces we don't understand as well. So there are two high energy protons coming in, and from them, you should think of them as high energy beams of quarks and gluons. And every now and then, two of them will pass very close to each other and engage in a short distance interaction or a high transverse momentum collision. And in this region, we can calculate perturbatively order by order in alpha S. We can also do experimental measurements to understand the structure of the proton. And then there's some kind of modeling that has to be done to get all the way out to the detectors, which are way out there. And so then after this initial interaction, there's actually a sequence of showering. So what you really see are not quarks and gluons at all, but generally jets of particles that remember where the quarks and gluons went. So you need to either model or get from experiment this outer stuff because it's very non-perturbative and it's hard to compute directly from QCD. Whereas this part you can compute perturbatively. So based on this whole picture, a lot of things were understood about what should show up at the LHC. And the Higgs boson was understood how it would be produced once its mass was determined. But the mass was not yet known. But then about a dozen years ago, on the 4th of July in 2012, the Atlas and CMS experiments announced that they had found the Higgs boson. This shows one of the pieces of evidence for it, which is a mass bump in the decay to 2 photons. Now, since then, no other elementary particle has been discovered at the LHC. And so a lot of the emphasis there, while a lot of it is still on searching for new phenomena, there's also sort of a precision phase that the LHC has entered, which involves measuring the properties of the Higgs and other standard model particles as they're produced at the LHC in order to look for some crack in this edifice in the standard model. And what this involves is both high statistics data and very clever experimental analysis, confronting precise theory that often involves complicated sums over perturbative contributions. And the perturbative contributions can be described in terms of Feynman diagrams, but there are also other ways to do that. And but there's been a huge effort on both the experimental and theoretical side. This shows one compilation of cross sections involving standard model particles. And there's a very large range in production cross sections. And over here, you can see the ratio of the experimental measurement to the theoretical prediction. And it's always consistent. And as you get to the rare processes, the experimental statistical errors start to get a lot larger, not surprisingly, but also the more complicated final states are still harder to compute as accurately. These gray bands here show the theoretical errors. So there's still a challenge to keep improving the theoretical errors, uncertainties to match improved experimental precision that will happen as the LHC moves into the high luminosity phase of the next decade. So here, for example, is the Higgs boson itself. And it's a case where I'll go into that one in slightly more detail, just as one example of the kinds of calculations you need to do in order to improve precision for things like the Higgs boson production cross-section. When you produce the Higgs at the LHC, what's kind of ironic is that the Higgs was sort of designed as something to give mass to all elementary particles. And the heaviest elementary particle we know is the top quark. And therefore, it has a very strong coupling to the top quark. But unfortunately, there are no top quarks inside the proton. So the best alternative is to use something of which there is a large amount inside the proton, and those are gluons. These are the force carriers of the strong interactions, the main quanta of QCD together with quarks, and they couple pretty strongly to quarks. And since the top quark has the strongest coupling to the Higgs, this process here, which involves a virtual pair of virtual top quark loop, actually gives the biggest cross section for the Higgs boson. And what I've shown here is a Feynman diagram and one loop that gives the leading amplitude. But to get the probability, we need to square the amplitude, and I've illustrated that by drawing the same thing over here. So this kind of means take that and multiply it by the complex conjugate, and that gives you the reaction probability or the cross section. So this leading order one loop amplitude squared, we could calculate it. It's no problem to calculate it exactly, but there's actually a very good approximation you can make, because the top, in particular, twice the mass of the top, which is really what matters, it's quite a bit larger than the Higgs mass. And so it's quite a good approximation to treat this top influence as hardly propagating at all and shrink this to a point. And when we shrink this to a point, we say that the Higgs effectively interacts with a pair of gluons, and we write down something which involves gluon field strengths. These are very similar to the electromagnetic field strength F mu nu, which is constructed from the electromagnetic potential. So there's an effective operator, effective interaction between the Higgs and the gluons that can be described this way. So that approximation makes it possible to calculate this interaction or this probability to very high order in the strong coupling. So in the general, all of those processes that we looked at compared to the Atlas measurements are some function of the strong coupling constant. In some cases, we know them to next to leading order. In some cases, to next to leading order in the expansion in the strong coupling. And in the Higgs case, and in a few other cases, we know the results to next to leading order. And you actually need all of those terms if you want to match the experimental precision. So this is a little bit of oversimplification, but this is roughly the Atlas and CMS measurements for this production cross-section in run 2 at 13 TeV. And here are the different orders of approximation. So this is leading order here, and you can see it's terrible. You have to multiply by over a factor of 2 to get to the most precise answer. You start to get more in the ballpark when you go to next to leading order, but there are still wide uncertainty bands. And only by the time you go to the third order do you get a precision which is better than the current uncertainties, which will get a lot better in the high luminosity era of the LHC. So even here, there's actually a desire to go to one more order in alpha S, the fourth order. This has a particularly bad behavior of the perturbative expansion. What kinds of things do you need to do to go to such high orders? When you go to one more order from LO to NLO, one of the things that can happen is that you can have an exchange of two gluons. Between the two gluons, you can have a virtual gluon there. That counts as 1 power of alpha S. There's a G for each of these interactions. But you could also put a coupling G here and another coupling G here. This is demarking the final state. Here we just have a Higgs in the final state, and here we have a Higgs and an additional gluon. This is called the real correction to GG to Higgs plus gluon. And so that you have to actually combine these two contributions because separately they're infinite. And if you combine them and a few other graphs, you can get the next to leading order correction. But the state of the art now is next to leading order. And in order to look at the kinds of things you need to assemble into that, you can have production of the Higgs alone with 3 gluons exchanged on one side, a triple virtual contribution. You can have various combinations of virtual plus real. And in order to carry out these calculations, one of the underlying building blocks are scattering amplitudes. That is, they're quantum mechanical things that you square up to get the probability distributions. And those are the things we're interested in understanding the structure of and feeding them into this framework in order to get more precise predictions for collider physics. So one of the reasons why we're not yet at M4LO is this amplitude. This amplitude is known at 2 loops. That's the state of the art now in QCD, but we don't quite yet know it to 3 loops, although it's pretty close. So now I want to give a very sort of brief description of sort of this story of how we've come to think of scattering amplitudes a bit differently from before. There is a way to calculate all these amplitudes by drawing large numbers of graphs, Feynman diagrams, and adding up the contributions of all of them. However, the whole is often much simpler than the sum of its parts. So, for example, at tree level, we could scatter these gluons off each other. They interact with each other non-linearly through these kinds of vertices. And if you added up each of these diagrams, you would get some fairly messy result. But if you label the gluons according to their helicity, you find that the sum is extremely simple. In fact, if all of the gluons are labeled as if they were outgoing and they all have positive helicity, or just one has negative helicity, then you get 0. If you turn 2 of them to negative helicity, you finally get something non-zero, but it's very simple when written in the right variables, which is something that was realized by Park and Taylor and Mangano, Park and Xu back in the 80s. So this notion that there are very simple combinations of Feynman diagrams, and we should understand the structure in a different way, is something that's been a theme ever since then. So it's sort of like, in condensed matter or soft condensed matter, you might study the behavior of sand. And if you just have a few grains of sand, then they're discrete. And that might be like having a few Feynman diagrams where you can understand kind of what the job of each Feynman diagram is. But once you get to processes where there are thousands or millions of Feynman diagrams, it no longer makes sense to think of each of them individually. It's more like thinking about how some granular material moves as a fluid. And so you want to think about the whole thing more holistically, or as some kind of a blob, and not look inside the blob. So to say it a different way, if you have this answer, which is without looking inside the blob, you know it's kind of a function of all the momenta that come in or out of the collision. And you should analyze what happens when these momenta go do interesting things. So one thing you can do is you can imagine that you go into a limit where the sum of all these momenta here makes up a massless momenta, which we call on shell. And in that limit, you know that this more complicated 8-point amplitude simplifies because of causality. It should be described by a 5-point amplitude multiplied by another one, because in this limit, this particle can propagate a very long distance. And so what happens here should be totally independent of what happens here. So this notion that you can use the smooth boundary behavior to assess the structure of scattering amplitudes and actually use it to compute it was something that was developed at tree level by Brito, Cacciazzo, Feng, and Witten about 20 years ago. And they used this picture to write down some recursion relations, which would give you scattering amplitudes with very large numbers of particles as sequences of simpler ones, products of them. So we have a picture that allows us to understand tree amplitudes in this sort of analytic sense. And these tree amplitudes are sort of all rational functions of the kinematic variables. But to go beyond tree level, we need to calculate Feynman diagrams that also have loop momenta in them. So the momenta are not all, there are momenta that come out of the process, but there's some free momenta that go around the process that you have to integrate over. So when you do these integrals, you get some very characteristic functions. And when you do it at one loop, you always get a specific type of function called the dilogarithm. And so it's one step past the logarithm. The logarithm is, of course, an integral of something like 1 over 1 minus t prime. And then you do another integral here to get the dilogarithm. So this kind of integral, called the Feynman integral, evaluates to this combination of these special functions. And the really nice thing is that here I've just given one example of it. But for arbitrary one-loop amplitudes, the only special function you ever need is this dilogarithm. And some of this was actually understood by Feynman and Brown as far back as 1952, and it's still true in more modern dimensional regularization and so on. So you can show that everything becomes linear combinations of these dilogarithms with many different arguments in complicated processes. But because of that, the problem of computing these next to leading order corrections, which involve one loop amplitudes, is a different kind of problem. And it took a while to sort of organize it, but there was a big advance around 2010. Prior to that, to go to a more complicated process, say 2 to 1, producing like a Higgs, or 2 to 2, gluon-gluon scattering, or dye-jet production, or 2 to 3, it took about a decade for each one. But then it was possible to use some of these ideas about fluidity and so on, more technically unitarity, to get many more processes. And so large numbers of processes could now be done at next to leading order. But next to leading order is not good enough for many of the requirements. And so you need to push on to next to leading order. And that involves amplitudes where you have 2 different loops that you have to integrate over. And now, instead of just getting dialogues, you get much more complicated functions. And you have to do not 2 integrations, but you have to do 4 integrations at 2 loops and 6 integrations at 3 loops. And in the best case, you get some functions called generalized or multiple polylogarithms. So they have a similar structure to the dilogarithm in the sense that you integrate one of them. Here we have one with n-1 indices, and you integrate dt over t minus a to get one more index. And there's some special cases, but basically, these are the best case that you have at the multi-loop level. But even with this recurrent dependence, they're very intricate multivariate functions. Nevertheless, understanding these functions was kind of the break in the bottleneck to go from 2 goes to 1 processes. Now we're looking at the development of next to leading order QCD at the LHC. And for quite a while, only 2 goes to 1 processes were known. And the bottleneck was understanding these generalized polylogarithms and how to incorporate them. And then a much wider class of 2 goes to 2 processes became available, including, for example, I mentioned the 2-loop Higgs plus gluon, which entered these next to leading order Higgs plus jet cross sections. So now NNLO is sort of the default for many of these basic 2 goes to 2 reactions, and N3LO is available for 2 goes to 1. Now, taking you on this kind of long journey, I wanted to connect back to this connection to this DNA code I was referring to. So these multiple polylogarithms, they have a structure associated with them called a symbol. And this symbol can be read out, and it's a sequence of letters, very much like DNA, this DNA code. And so the complexity is encoded in certain words that are written in an alphabet. And the alphabet is actually defined by differentiating these functions multiple times. So this code is this analog of the DNA code. It characterizes most of the answer, and you can reconstruct the rest of it from it. And you can actually learn to read it and use that understanding to go to higher loop orders, and all based on some of these ideas of fluidity and so on. So just to give you an illustration, in the case of glue to Higgs plus glue, which we saw was available at NNLO, that was essentially because, or was made possible in part by knowing this kind of amplitude with 2 gluons in and a Higgs and gluon out, this interaction here, and then 2 loops. But that's sort of the state of the art for QCD. But using some of these properties of the symbol, and importantly, switching to a simpler theory called planar n equals 4, we can actually compute the analogous amplitude to 8 loops. So there are these ways to use the symmetries of the theory to sort of bypass the direct Feynman diagram computation, which can be exploited to the maximum in the special theory for this kind of analogous process. This planar n equals 4 is not something most of you have heard about, but it's a great testing ground for QCD amplitudes. Some of the early ideas that led into the NLO progress came out of this theory, and it's quite close in the sense that it has gluons that interact exactly in the same way as in QCD. And the matter, however, is not quarks, but it involves some other particles called gluons and scalars. And all these particles are unified together into a single sort of multiplet under this n equals 4 supersymmetry. And the general amplitude in QCD will be a fairly complicated combination of special functions like these polylogs multiplied by rational functions. But in this particular theory, this rational structure is extremely well understood, and doesn't vary from loop to loop. And so you can just focus on these transcendental functions. So when you build the symbol, it's actually a lot like sequencing DNA. You have a sequence and you want to cleave off the last base pair and analyze it, and then repeat the process in order to read off the sequence. In the case of taking these functions and analyzing them theoretically, what you do is you take the derivative and you read out the derivative, and it tells you what the last letter is. And then you take the thing in front and you take its derivative again, and you keep repeating the process. And in doing that, you can generate these long sequences of letters. A little more mathematically, you take the derivative of a function, you can decompose it into some things which are derivatives of logarithms, and these quantities here are the letters. So we could, like, if we had 6 letters, we could label them A, B, C, D, E, F. And then this is the remaining string, and then you differentiate it again, and you will peel off more and more of these letters. Mathematically, there's something called a Hopf algebra, which splits something that has n integrations into things that have one fewer integration, tensored with logarithms. And when you keep iterating this process, you eventually get a big tensor here, which is called the symbol. And at this point, everything is reduced to logarithms, sort of tensored together, and then a set of rational numbers in front. And this represents a large fraction of the complexity of the original function, but it sort of solves all identities between different functions, and it's extremely systematic and a great way to analyze things. These there are classical polylogarithms that sort of generalize the dilogarithms, where you integrate them dt over t, and those give rise to those are functions that have very simple series expansions and branch cut behavior, and they also have a symbol which can be read off, and it has a very simple alphabet. It only involves the argument of the polylog x, and then also 1 minus x appears. So this is one special case where this integral formula, if you differentiate it, you find that the derivative of the LIN gives you the next lower one, and then you get a d log of x, which comes out here. So you can easily compute these symbols for sets of polylogarithms, and you can even sort of construct those based on the symbol alone. This is the function one of the functions that shows up in this one loop process for 2 gluons to Higgs plus glue, and it involves some of these Mandelstam variables. You can form some dimensionless ratios out of them, and then when you compute the symbol, you get a rather simple structure. And the only letters that show up are six different letters involving ratios of Lorentz invariants or Mandelstams, and 1 minus these quantities as well. So there's this 6-letter alphabet. So for this process, the alphabet is not much worse than the DNA alphabet, 6 letters instead of 4. And you can actually rearrange it slightly and define some letters A, B, C, D, E, F, which are really just simple ratios of the previous ones. And when you do that, you can start to assemble these symbols of the answers. And so you get these particular sequences with always, in this case, integer prefactors. So the 1 and 2 loop ones are particularly simple because there's a particular dihedral symmetry. So there's essentially just one term, and the rest are related by a certain symmetry transformation. Here, there are 2 separate terms plus symmetry. As you go to higher loops, though, you get more and more terms. So the number of terms in the symbol actually explodes quite a bit. This is not the most, this is one of the more verbose ways of representing the answer. So you get millions and even billions of terms here, which are all these sequences of 6 letters and various integers appearing in front of them. This sequence will actually show up in a second in another guise. So as a result, you should probably not look at the full symbol directly. You should find ways to analyze it structurally in order to see what's going on. But there is a lot of data to be mined from it. And one of the things we've been doing recently is trying to apply machine learning to understand the structure of the symbol. The symbol is not exactly the full answer. Because you've taken all of these derivatives, you've lost a lot of constants. So it's more like a scaffolding for the full function. But it contains in it information that allows you to really reconstruct everything if you also track boundary values at some point. But it's still very important to find the symbol, as Van Braun pointed out in one of his lesser known novels, the lost symbol. So let me just mention that there are loads of patterns inside the symbol, some of which we've been able to find and some of which we're still trying to understand. And I'm just going to focus on this one specific process where we have these 6 letters. The 6 letters are not all equal. There's actually a dihedral symmetry that rotates A, B, and C into each other, so they're sort of all equivalent. And D, E, and F can be rotated into each other. But there's an asymmetry in the sense that the symbol always starts with A, B, or C, and it never starts with D, E, and F. That rule is sort of like if you have something that codes for something interesting in DNA, you always have to have a start codon to tell the machinery to start translating there. So this A, B, or C is somehow analogous to that. This is an example where we understand physically why it happens. These A, B's, and C's are the reason why D, E, and F never appear at the beginning has something to do with where branch cuts are allowed to appear in scattering. When you have 2 momenta that are massless, the only interesting things happen when you flip the sign of momentum invariance from negative to positive around 0. And that turns out to be encoded in this restriction that you only start with A, B, or C. But there are many other patterns that show up. For example, we find that A never appears next to D and B next to E. This is actually related by a cyclic symmetry, but there are sort of 2 sets of adjacency relations, which were very surprising when we found them. They actually resemble some constraints from causality. Causality constrained this first entry, and these pair adjacency relations looked very much like relations that were found by Steinman back in 1960. But they don't quite match, and so we were actually kind of mystified for a while. So this example I gave was the case where we can compute these things through the most number of loops, through 8 loops. But these symbol alphabets are actually understood for many other processes. In fact, they've been studied a lot for many QCD reactions. But in the context of this simple theory, planar n equals 4, they're understood for scattering amplitudes with a large number of gluons. It turns out that if you have only gluons and you don't have this Higgs-like particle or operator, then the scattering of gluons is pretty trivial until you get to 6 gluons. At the point you hit 6 gluons, you find you have a 9-letter alphabet. It actually 6 of them look very similar to the problem I was describing before. And then there are 3 more which are more complicated and have complicated square roots in them. In the case of 7 gluons, the alphabet gets longer than the English alphabet. It has 42 letters. And in the n equals 8 case, we don't even really know the full alphabet. There are at least 222 letters. So as you get to these more complicated systems, it's harder and harder to analyze high loop order amplitudes because of the very large number of these letters. Now, these structures actually are closely tied to a recent area of much recent mathematical activity called cluster algebras, which were invented by Fomin and Zolovinsky. And also there's connections to other areas of math called tropical geometry and polytopes. But coming back to the 6-point amplitude, because it had a relatively simple alphabet of only 9 letters, we were able to apply the same techniques, actually a little earlier, to this problem, and we managed to compute these the amplitudes and their symbols up to 7 loops. And so we could write down the number of terms that they had, and it was growing pretty rapidly. But if we drop onto a particular subspace, which is very natural to do, we find that the number of terms starts to collapse. And I don't know if anybody remembers the previous sequence of numbers, but this is exactly the same set of numbers. And so anyway, once we saw that these numbers exactly corresponded to the previous set, we looked and we found that on the surface, the number of letters here dropped down to 6, which is the same number we had in the other process. And furthermore, there was an exact map between these two processes. So the relation, though, involved a very strange operation, which is to reverse the order of all these letters in the word. So this operation is called the antipode map by the mathematicians. And so there's something we call antipodal duality, which relates the 2 different processes here. One involving some operator, like the one that makes the Higgs boson in the standard model, and one involving the scattering of 6 gluons. Now, this is in this very special theory, planar n equals 4, but it's a very mysterious object that happens. So you need to compute the 6 gluon amplitude from this form factor, you just apply this antipode map. And at the same time, you have to do a substitution on the letters here, which, and once you do that, you map the symbols over here exactly into the symbols over here. At first, we had 8 loops on this side and 7 loops on this side, but we could use this map to get to 8 loops on this side as well.
So is the map proven, or is it just something observed at the 7th order and then you?
This is totally empirical. It could break down in 9 loops, but I'd be willing to bet you that it doesn't. But there are some other situations, which I was going to talk about tomorrow, where we can at least prove a similar map works through arbitrary orders in some other system of integrals. But in this case, it's just an empirical observation. We're still trying to understand what's behind it. We have some clues, but we don't really have any physical understanding at all of why it should be there. I can say though that it's consistent with this mystery of those adjacency constraints. They occurred in a process where we don't know how to apply the Steinman relation, because there are not enough massless particles, it turns out. But it maps to something in the 6 gluon case where we have 3 particle invariants, and we can look at some Steinman relations that involve different 3 particle invariants. Anyway, we get some constraints in the other problem which map exactly onto these constraints in the form factor. So, yep.
You understand correctly that your symbols are related to something that mathematicians call motifs.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the question. So this antipodal duality is discovered in motifs also.
So, well, let's see. There's a couple of questions. I described how it acts on this symbol, which is the maximal iteration of the Hopf algebra. Yeah, but it also can be applied at higher levels where you take into account zeta values. And so it applies to coefficients that appear in front of motivic zeta values, and you map from one process to the other. I don't know if that was answering your question, but there's actually more to it than just reversing the symbol.
So basically, you are saying that the principle duality can be defined mathematically motives, but it is not clear whether it's related to physics.
So it seems to show up in a few physics places, but it's not yet predictable exactly where it shows up. But we should definitely talk more later. So, but because we've just discovered this empirically, we're still trying to search around to understand what the physical reason for this duality is. We have one other example which explains this one in some sense, but we don't understand it. So we're sort of pushing the problem back a stage. But in view of time, I won't go into that one here. But if you come to the seminar tomorrow, I will have more details on that. What I wanted to sort of conclude with is that the step back, take kind of a big picture. There's been a lot of developments in this area of scattering amplitudes more broadly. And we have kind of a philosophical approach to it, which is that if you can invent some new algorithms of some type, perhaps based on some principles, you could use those to compute higher orders. And if you compute to higher orders, you can start to see more patterns. And finding those patterns may eventually lead to inventing better algorithms. And one of the questions is this find thing. You know, you can have accidental things that pop out at you, but is there a more systematic way to find patterns? So one thing I've been playing around with is whether AI can assist in finding patterns. And in this case, we have a system which already looks a lot like language. And in the sense that everything's organized according to words and then integer prefactors. And those integers are quantized, so they could be tokenized and thought of as letters in some alphabet as well. So then if you have language, you immediately think that you should apply large language models, or at least the things that underlie them, which are based on particular architectures called transformers. So we want to know if transformers can understand the properties of these amplitudes and help us to go further, at least in this toy model of planar n equals 4. So this is some work I've been doing with Hyunji Kai, Garrett Mertz, Francois Charton, Nick Nolte, Matthias Wilhelm, who is also on some of the other antipodal duality papers, and Kyle Kramer. And one of the first experiments we did was we presented a model with a large list of terms in this big symbol, which associated this sequence with some numbers in front. And we asked it to predict the numbers in front of other sequences that we hadn't told it about yet. And then it gets trained through a number of epochs. And you can see that the accuracy improves, and eventually it's like 98, 99%. The one thing that's kind of interesting about the learning dynamics is it doesn't go straight from 0 to 100. It actually spends some time in a little plateau here. And at the plateau, it has about 50% accuracy. And then we look a little closer at what's happening in that plateau, and we see that at this point, it's got the magnitudes basically right, but the signs are basically random. And so it starts off trying to make all the signs positive. In fact, 50% of them are positive and 50% negative, and it oscillates around for a while, and eventually it damps out. So in this phase where it's got the magnitudes right, the system is kind of like a spin glass. It has a bunch of pluses and minuses it's trying to figure out, and the training loss function is like some Hamiltonian and some random spin system that it's trying to sort out. But eventually it manages to do that. So this is one of the things we did. We also did some other experiments that tried to correlate coefficients between two different loop orders. And it did this, but it wouldn't tell us how it did it. There's always a big question of interpretability. But it suggested to us that we look for recursion relations that connect two different loop orders. So we actually, even without the machine's help, we stored a bunch of sequences. This is the coefficient that sits inside something with a B, and then everything else is D's. It's this sequence here, which everybody knows is this kind of double factorial. Or at least you could type it into the online encyclopedia of integer sequences if you didn't recognize it yourself. So anyway, we have a whole bunch of these sequences, and then motivated by some of these AI experiments, we could rewrite them in this sort of recursive fashion, where these sequences are all related to these. And there's some interesting structure here, which we still need to explore more. So all of this sort of theoretical data is something that is a really area where we could do a lot more with machine learning, we think. But to go back to the more general setting, even beyond the specific processes we talked about here, there's a more general code that's based on this object called the symbol of generalized polylogs, which has proven quite useful for many QCD loop calculations, as well as the planar n=4 setting. The symbol has very sort of form that's very systematic, where at L loops you get at most 2L of these letters. And it can be that the letters can actually be understood using mathematical approaches known as Landau singularities. At least there's a lot of work going on in that direction. But it's a general tool for disentangling the structure of these scattering amplitudes. In the context of planar n=4, having this symbol available has unveiled this strange antipodal duality, which we're still trying to understand. The swapping kind of changes the role of derivatives and branch cuts, so has a sort of very strange behavior. It's explained by another form factor, which we can talk about tomorrow. So I'll just say that it's still an open question how much further we can push some of these methods to better understand both the fundamental structure of amplitudes and apply it to specific computations in QCD. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Question?
I have the following question. Really, in your papers, in old papers, there is a wonderful idea that one should look not at the amplitudes, but at the integrants.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
And I think that there is an interesting question about your antipodal duality. Can it be formulated in the language of integrants?
That's a great question, because it somehow should correspond to reversing orders of integrations. But in this vein, we have actually avoided the integrands because they're great at lower loop orders, but to get to 8 loops, they're just too hard. So then in some of the higher loop stuff, we sort of bypassed the integration step. But it would be great to go back and revisit it and see if there's ways to use it to understand this duality. There are other kinds of representations of some integrands that are not kind of from the Feynman point of view, and those are particularly interesting to look at from the point of view of another system where we see this happening. I can tell you more about that later. Sergey?
I was curious, how large is the transformer model you used, how many parameters, and for how many GPU hours you trained it?
So I didn't do most of the training, but I think it has, I want to say about 1 billion parameters. So I think it's a lot, thousands of times smaller than the large language models, and it can be trained on, GPUs in days or something. It's not very big. If we kind of knew what we were doing better, we would maybe try to put more resources in, but so far it's pretty modest on the computation side.
Shit, I have one question.
Yeah.
This antipodal duality, kind of was human discovered. Could you actually find a machine learning method to find dualities, like just in an unsupervised way, find structure?
Well, so we did use some baby machine learning. This is the okay, so this thing was discovered by humans staring at expressions and noticing that they looked similar. Okay, so that really came out of nowhere. But then what I'll say more about tomorrow is that there's another process that sits above both of these. And we had reason to suspect that there might be a similar one here. So you can gather evidence that it might be there by a counting argument. You can do some counting argument, which is necessary but not sufficient. Certain numbers have to be symmetric when you turn things around because it's a self-duality. But that doesn't tell you how to find a map. So there's a map that goes from here to here. And that map had to map 34 letters into 34 letters. Whereas here, there was sort of a very simple 6-letter map. So the way we found the 34-letter map was we wrote down all 34-letter maps. It's a 34 by 34 parameter matrix. And then we wrote a loss function that has a minimum when it does what we want it to do. And it's positive definite, and it's only 0, hopefully where we want. And so we used the gradient descent part of machine learning, which is a small piece of machine learning, but it worked very well and it locked on to this map. So that's an example where we used, I would call it baby machine learning.
You still have to target it though.
We had to decide, we had a very specific thing in mind.
Yeah.
So, what we would like to do that is a little less supervised is generalize this kind of structure, for example. So we have some very specific recurrence relations here that happen to be very simple, so we can find them ourselves. And they have like long strings of D's at the back, so they're very special. But we kind of think there should be many more of these sequences threading through this set of data. And so we would like to hand that problem off to a machine framework. And there's approaches to symbolic regression, genetic algorithms, something called fun search that some of my collaborators are playing around with now to see if we can, and that would be a much less of a structured thing than along the lines you're talking about.